Hi, welcome to this presentation on sexual exploitation and trafficking in Minnesota. My name is Sarah Florman, and I'm the Trafficking Policy Coordinator at the Sexual Violence Justice Institute at the Minnesota Coalition Against Sexual Assault. The objectives for this presentation are to define sexual exploitation and sex trafficking, to recognize the risk factors and dynamics, to describe Minnesota's safe harbor law, and to identify some ways that service providers can meet the needs of victim survivors of sexual exploitation and trafficking. First, let's define sexual exploitation and trafficking and examine the differences between the terms. In Minnesota, when we talk about sexual exploitation, we're usually referring to commercial sexual exploitation. The distinction is that commercial sexual exploitation involves the exchange of sex for something of value. A transaction is taking place. According to the Minnesota Department of Health, minor commercial sexual exploitation occurs when someone under the age of 18 engages in commercial sexual activity. A commercial sexual activity occurs when anything of value or a promise of anything of value, such as money, drugs, food, shelter, rent, or higher status in a gang or group, is given to a person by any means in exchange for any type of sexual activity. A third party may or may not be involved. The concept of a third party is the primary differentiation between exploitation and trafficking. Trafficking involves a third party who is facilitating or benefiting from the transaction. Sexual exploitation is a huge issue, accompanying a wide range of issues related to sexual violence, including sexual abuse and assault, as well as sexual harassment. Commercial sexual exploitation is a subset within this category and includes things like survival sex, stripping, pornography, and transactional sex, sometimes referred to as prostitution. Sex trafficking is a type of commercial sexual exploitation, and it requires the involvement of a third party, often referred to as the trafficker, who facilitates or profits from the transaction. This could include someone who posts online ads for another person or provides transportation for someone to engage in commercial sexual activity. This graphic provides a simplified explanation of the differences between sexual exploitation and sex trafficking, but in reality, these issues are nuanced and it might be difficult to determine whether there's a trafficker involved. When talking about sexual exploitation and sex trafficking, one of the first questions that I'm usually asked is who is at risk? You've likely seen images of trafficking victims portrayed in the media. These often include common themes or stereotypes, such as depictions of young white girls who are physically bound with ropes or chains or otherwise physically restrained. They may have hands or tape over their mouths. You might see images of street-level prostitution. Victims in these photos might show a need or a desire to be rescued. You might see images like barcodes and words like slavery. You might also see various facts and statistics, often without cited sources. These representations are harmful to victim survivors of trafficking and exploitation, as they portray an unrealistic image of victims, causing real victims to remain unseen and unidentified. Organizations hoping to draw awareness to the issues of sexual exploitation and sex trafficking frequently use statistics to increase a community's concern about the issue. The truth is, however, the existing data on this topic is incomplete, and many groups are underrepresented, giving an inaccurate picture of the scope of the problem. Although the highest percentage of documented, identified victims of exploitation and trafficking of youth are girls of color from poor communities, people of all demographics are potentially at risk, and many are often underrepresented in the data. This includes boys and gender nonconforming youth, LGBTQ+ youth, folks from middle to upper class communities, all races, and all ages. Although the current safe harbor laws apply only to youth ages 24 and under, adults can also be victims of sex trafficking. A 2018 study identified the top 5 risk factors for youth to be sex trafficked and found that they're the same across geographic spaces. History of abuse, family instability or dysfunction, running away from home, housing instability or homelessness, and addiction. There are a number of other risk factors that make young people and people of any age vulnerable to traffickers. Things like poverty, lack of community resources, lack of support systems, a history of out-of-home placement or child protection involvement, school dropout, emotional distress, family member involvement in trafficking, mental health issues, gang affiliation, folks in marginalized or oppressed populations, and immigration status can all also be risk factors. Next, we'll focus on the dynamics of sex trafficking and the overall process of becoming involved in trafficking. Traffickers generally follow a process that involves 3 phases. The process may appear different case by case, but the foundation is the same. Traffickers begin by recruiting victims, then using initiation or breaking techniques to gain control, and finally by presenting barriers to escape and using tactics to maintain control of victims. There are a number of common methods of recruitment. This could involve a relationship with someone involved in trafficking, such as a family member, a boyfriend, or a girlfriend. Survival sex is often an entry point into trafficking and makes people highly vulnerable. In addition to that, coercion using drugs or alcohol can be a common risk factor. There's situations where involvement in trafficking or exploitation might be the norm in a family, or a parent might have a drug or alcohol addiction or need extra income. A boyfriend or a girlfriend might start as a typical relationship and then evolve into a trafficking situation. Other common methods of recruitment include being lured through promises of work or benefits. Youth might start working as dancers in a strip club or respond to advertisements for modeling work. Social media is also a major area where recruitment takes place. This can include online relationships and meetups because predators can pose as anyone online. When we talk about social media and recruitment for trafficking, this includes usual suspects like Facebook, Snapchat, and Instagram, but it also includes things like gaming sites and any apps with chat capabilities, such as multiplayer games, mindfulness apps, things like Words with Friends. Apps like that where you're allowed to communicate with other players are all potential places for recruiters. The next phase is initiation and breaking. This often begins with isolation, and this isolation can be social isolation as well as physical. To socially isolate their victims, traffickers separate youth from their friends and family. You might say things like, "They don't understand you or love you like I do." Or you might take away or begin monitoring their cell phone and social media. Physical isolation can be as simple as not allowing someone to go anywhere alone, or not allowing them to see certain friends or family, or maybe even moving them away from the area. Physical isolation can also include taking identifying documents like driver's license, social security cards, or immigration papers. Traffickers use various forms of abuse to further isolate and break their victims. This might include interpersonal violence, or coercion, or threats of harm to the victim or the victim's family. Another way to break the victim into the life is to get them hooked on drugs or alcohol. This makes victims more compliant and controllable, or the victim may go along to feed their drug or alcohol addiction. This can lead to long-term harms of all sorts, including criminal charges, inability to hold a job, lack of access to housing, and simply being seen as less credible as a witness. Their partner or trafficker may take nude photos or videos and use them to blackmail the victim into compliance. Traffickers may use phrases like, "You're damaged goods," "No one else will want you," threats of criminal prosecution for drugs or other crimes. They may threaten deportation. They could say, "I'll call ICE and report you." Traffickers exploit a trauma bond. They say things like, "I love you, no one cares about you like I do." They may give their victim a new name or identity and erase their old self. In addition, traffickers might also use tattoos, such as the trafficker's name or a symbol, as a brand that signifies ownership. How do traffickers sustain the relationship? They continue their use of the breaking techniques. They use violence or the threat of violence to maintain control. They might make an example of one victim to show other victims what will happen if they try to leave. They might keep money and documents from victims, which basically prevents someone from being able to gain employment or housing, keeping them fully reliant on the trafficker. Other methods of control include threats to family or children, causing or exploiting a pregnancy, or applying pressure and guilt by playing the friendship or boyfriend card. Methods of control might also involve what's called a bottom relationship, where one victim is given authority over other victims and charged with keeping them in line. The victim is now complicit, and it's difficult to find the line. So it's easier for the trafficker to say, "You can't turn me in because you'll get in trouble too." Anyone and everyone has access to transactional sex, but research has shown that buyers tend to be white, married men from middle and upper socioeconomic backgrounds. They tend to be respected and influential members in their communities. Most buyers don't purchase sex where they live. They typically travel an average of 30 to 60 miles. Trafficking and exploitation is happening around you. It's happening in malls, airports, clubs, shelters, parks, and on the street. There are a number of myths surrounding where and when trafficking occurs, such as the Super Bowl myth. Although there is increased trafficking activity surrounding large events, this is true for any large-scale event where people are coming in from out of town. This means that hunting lodges and resorts are also places where trafficking happens. In addition, there are many illicit massage parlors in suburban Minnesota where sex trafficking occurs daily. Now let's discuss some information helpful to service providers who are working with sexually exploited or trafficked youth. It's important to be aware that any youth you work with may also be a victim of trafficking or exploitation. You may or may not know in advance that the person you're working with was exploited or trafficked, and it may not be directly related to the situation that brought you into their life. The same 2018 study I mentioned earlier also identified the top 5 indicators that a youth might be a victim of sex trafficking, and again found that they're the same across geographic spaces. Those indicators are a history of sexual assault, mental health concerns, drug and alcohol abuse or overdose, chronic runaway, or a youth with untreated STIs. There are a number of additional potential indicators that someone is being exploited or trafficked. Things like having money, a phone, or other items of value that can't be explained or accounted for. Social media with sexually explicit posts, or a relationship with an older partner, or they're unwilling to provide information about their partner. While keeping these indicators in mind, it's important to also be aware that you may encounter someone being exploited or trafficked who displays none of these warning signs. There are a number of factors that make identification and service provision difficult for victim survivors of sexual exploitation and sex trafficking. Many of these characteristics also make these victims more vulnerable to becoming involved in other systems, such as criminal justice or child protection. For instance, the victim may not think they've been exploited or trafficked. They may refuse help. They may defend their trafficker. They're frequently not compliant with law enforcement or advocacy. These youth may not think of themselves as a victim. They may feel that they're being independent and surviving. They may not want to be saved or rescued. Victim survivors of sexual exploitation and sex trafficking frequently go through multiple cycles of leaving and returning before they're ready to exit the life permanently. Because these folks don't present as typical victims and express that they have chosen to engage in these activities, it's important to remember what does and does not constitute a real choice. It's not a choice if the choice to leave is removed. If the choice is between something you don't want to do and something that is harmful. If the choice is between something harmful and something even more harmful. If the terms under which you made your original choice were changed by someone in a position of power. It's not a choice if this is your only choice. And it's not a choice if harm has been normalized as a choice. Under Minnesota law, sex trafficking is defined as receiving, recruiting, enticing, harboring, providing, or obtaining by any means an individual to aid in the prostitution of the individual, or receiving profit or anything of value, knowing or having reason to know it is derived from prostitution. Sex trafficking is a mandated report to Child Protection for youth under 18, and Child Protection is required to investigate all alleged sex trafficking. Sexual exploitation, however, is not a mandated report and does not require an automatic investigation. In Minnesota, Child Protection and child welfare agencies are able to offer resources and support through the Safe Harbor Network to youth who've been sexually exploited. This highlights the importance of understanding that distinction between exploitation and trafficking that we discussed earlier. Minnesota's law does not require a showing of force, fraud, or coercion for victims of any age. This is different from the federal definition. In Minnesota, we recognize that a person can be exploited in a variety of ways, including but not always involving force, fraud, or coercion. By removing this requirement, the focus is on the actions of the trafficker or the person doing the exploiting. It also means that a person's prior involvement in prostitution or their apparent consent to being exploited is not a defense to the charge of trafficking. Even so, there are still many multidisciplinary partners, community leaders, and members of the general public who do not know how Minnesota law defines trafficking, and many victims continue to go unidentified. Prior to passing Minnesota's Safe Harbor law for sexually exploited youth, we had a conflict in our state laws. A juvenile under the age of 18 engaging in prostitution was at the same time a victim and a criminal. Buying sex from a minor was a felony offense, and so of course was trafficking a minor for sex. However, youth could still be arrested for engaging in prostitution. You can see how this creates a problem depending on who is enforcing the law. Some investigators and prosecutors recognized a sexually exploited youth as a victim, while others were of the mindset that if money exchanged hands, the youth was a child prostitute and not a true victim. As a state, we had to change the way we viewed youth who were engaged in prostitution, not as child prostitutes, but as victims of sexual exploitation and trafficking. By decriminalizing prostitution for youth under the age of 18, Minnesota's Safe Harbor law changed the state's legal response, but also forced everyone to change the way they thought about sexual exploitation. Minnesota's Safe Harbor law is a statewide effort that recognizes juveniles who are commercially sexually exploited as victims and not criminals, and directs them to services and away from criminal sanctions. Commercial sexually exploited youth who are under 18 years old can no longer be criminalized for engaging in prostitution and instead should be referred to services. They can no longer be found guilty of their own exploitation. While this conflict was resolved for juveniles, it still exists for adult victims of trafficking. Prior to the Safe Harbor law, many prosecutors were not prosecuting juvenile victims of trafficking for engaging in prostitution, and some law enforcement officers who would find victims would try to find them services and avoid arresting them. However, the threat of delinquency charges was also sometimes used as a tool to obtain cooperation. In those instances, the goal of the arrest or detention would be to keep the victim away from their pimp or safe from the streets, and officers have said it was sometimes the only way to keep the victim safe. With the implementation of the Safe Harbor law, the state has incorporated a number of services, including a statewide director, a network of regional navigators, specialized services, and housing and shelter. The Safe Harbor Network is a cooperative effort between the Minnesota Department of Health, the Department of Human Services, and the Department of Public Safety. MDH houses the Safe Harbor Director and oversees the regional navigators and grants for specialized services. DHS oversees housing and shelter grants, and the Department of Public Safety has the statewide task force out of the Bureau of Criminal Apprehension and provides law enforcement training across the state. In addition, MNCASA participates in the Safe Harbor Network, providing guidance, training, and support on developing community protocols to respond to sexual exploitation and trafficking in communities. Victim survivors of sex trafficking and sexual exploitation may encounter the criminal justice system in different ways. They may be a victim of exploitation or trafficking, or a victim of another crime. You may also find that the victim is the one being charged for drug and alcohol offenses, peripheral crimes such as check fraud or theft, and other crimes that they may have been directed to engage in by their trafficker. In addition, the victim may be a bottom, as we discussed earlier, and charged with also exploiting or trafficking themselves or others. When meeting the needs of victims, you want to consider three things. First, consider safety, which involves safety planning. This includes shelter, knowing the geographical area, providing important phone numbers, and determining when to involve law enforcement. This might involve orders for protection or restraining orders. This might also involve mandated reporting in cases of suspected trafficking. The next need is survival. This includes housing, employment, benefits, education, legal assistance in a variety of areas. The victim survivor is also going to need support, and that might include one-on-one therapy or mentorship, support groups, aftercare, chemical dependency treatment, mental health services, and services that help youth with identity issues. Responding to the complex trauma of victims of sexual exploitation and trafficking is a complex issue that takes a lot of time and a variety of community members and services. Here are a few things to keep in mind when doing this work. Offering services is important. Connect youth with resources. Remember that the youth may not want help at this time, but might want this information for future use. And most importantly, remember that rapport and relationship building is critical. If you are someone that they trust, they may come to you when they're ready to exit the life. Thank you for viewing this presentation on sexual exploitation and trafficking in Minnesota. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions or would like additional resources.